The snowstorm was so thick, Jack could barely see the road until a bloodied golden retriever limped into his headlights and changed his life forever. What he didn't know, the dog's owner was watching from the mansion next door. If you love stories about unexpected friendships, loyal dogs, an unlikely love smash, that like button, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. The wind screamed over the ridge like some wild, invisible beast, clawing its way down into the valley as snow pelted the windshield of Jack's battered pickup truck. Each flake seemed to thud against the glass like gravel, melting into icy rivulets that smeared beneath the tired wipers. He leaned forward, knuckles white on the steering wheel, trying to spot the road through the swirling white that erased the world around him. The pine trees lining the edge of the drive had vanished. Only the mailbox post at the corner of Birch Hollow Road offered any sense of direction, barely visible as a vague gray shadow. Jack wasn't afraid of snow. Born and raised in these mountains, he'd grown up in storms that could swallow a house whole, but this one was mean. It had come on too fast, creeping over the pass that morning with nothing more than a cold wind and gray light, then exploding into full fury by late afternoon. The temperature had dropped so quickly his breath inside the cab fogged the glass even with the heat cranked to max. The smell of scorched dust from the old truck's vents mingled with the sharp, almost metallic scent of snow seeping through the cracks in the doors. He cursed softly, mostly at himself. He should have packed up earlier from the repair job at the Bensons' place, but the porch had rotted clear through and he hadn't wanted them stepping out and falling into the crawl space. He'd thought he could beat the worst of it home. Now he was crawling at barely 10 miles an hour, one tire threatening to lose grip with each bump in the road. In the passenger seat, a thermos rattled against a toolbox. In the back, tied down beneath a tarp, were his tool Severy last one, a lifeline to his business. Mikey's booster seat sat in the back row, empty now, but a quiet reminder of how precious time was. His son would be waiting with Mrs. Hadley, who lived half a mile up the ridge from their place. She had kept Mikey before, ever since school let out for winter break. Jack had promised he'd be back by 5. It was almost 7 now. No cell service out here either, not since the tower iced over. His stomach twisted, not from hunger but guilt. The road dipped, and he felt the wheels shift as if skating on glass. He eased up on the gas and whispered a prayer, his breath tight in his chest, and that's when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a bundle of snow, but something moved. A flash of tawny fur dragging itself across the icy road, directly in the path of his headlights. He slammed the brakes. The truck fishtailed to the side, tires squealing in protest, snow flying in a wave past the hood. His heart slammed into his ribs. The animal collapsed in the middle of the lane, one paw stretched forward, breath heaving in visible clouds. Jack flung the door open without thinking and was instantly swallowed in cold. The wind knifed into his jeans, his jacket, his boots. Snow whipped his cheeks raw. He trudged forward, one hand shielding his eyes, the other reaching out. It was a dog, golden retriever maybe, medium-sized, its fur caked in ice and blood. One hind leg bent at a strange angle, and there were scratches along its muzzle like it had fought its way through thorns or barbed wire. Its eyes flicked up to meet his, and what he saw there stopped him still. Terror, pain, but also trust. He dropped to one knee, snow seeping through to his skin in seconds. The dog didn't growl, didn't flinch, just watched him, barely breathing. "You poor thing," Jack murmured, brushing snow from its head. "Where the hell did you come from?" The dog whined softly, a sound that hit something deep in his chest. He slipped off his jacket and wrapped it around the dog, lifting it as gently as he could. It was lighter than he expected, starved maybe, or just too cold to carry its weight. Back in the cab, he cranked the heat again and placed the dog carefully on the seat beside him, tucking the jacket tighter around its body. Its eyes closed, ears twitching. He could see one paw was swollen, the pads raw and pink from exposure. Frostbite, maybe worse. "You hang in there," he said, voice rough. "You hang on, okay?" He checked the rearview mirror out of habit. Nothing but a curtain of white. He hadn't seen a single car in over an hour. No footprints in the road, either. Wherever this dog had come from, it had made the journey alone. The truck sputtered once, the engine wheezing like an old man. Jack patted the dashboard. "Don't quit on me now." It took another 30 minutes to crawl the final mile. He had to stop twice to clear slush from the wipers. The dog whimpered each time he opened the door, the blast of wind cutting through whatever warmth he'd managed to build. When he finally turned onto the gravel lane leading to the cabin, relief coursed through him like adrenaline. The faint outline of the porch lights blinked through the storm, swaying with the wind but steady. He pulled up close, cut the engine, and took a deep breath. Then he reached for the dog. Its eyes opened just a crack, watching him silently. He bundled it against his chest, climbed out, and made for the porch. The steps were slick, but he knew them like muscle memory. Inside, the warmth of the old wood stove greeted him like a hug. He kicked the door shut behind him and dropped to his knees, laying the dog gently on the braided rug beside the fire. Mikey came barreling from the hallway, hair tousled, cheeks flushed from sleep. "Dad, you're back!" Mrs. Hadley said the storm was bad, and whoa, his eyes locked onto the dog. "Who's that?" Jack caught his breath, stripped off his wet flannel shirt, and tossed it over the back of a chair. "Found her in the road. Hurt bad. Gotta get her warm." Mikey knelt beside the dog, his small hand brushing gently against her head. "She's beautiful." "She's lucky," Jack said, throwing another log on the fire. The flames flared, casting golden light across the room. "And we're lucky she found us." He turned to grab towels, bandages, the old first aid kit buried under the kitchen sink. As he moved, he felt the weight of the storm still pressing on the cabin walls. But inside, in that circle of warmth beside the fire, the world had become still. And in the eyes of the broken dog resting beside his son, Jack saw something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Hope. The fire had settled into a quiet rhythm, the flames flickering low but steady, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls of the cabin. Outside, the blizzard howled with relentless fury, gusts of snow hurling themselves against the windows in a muffled percussion, but inside, the warmth had begun to spread. The thick scent of pine smoke curled through the air, mingling with the faint aroma of chamomile from the tea Jack had poured but forgotten to drink. The golden retriever lay on a folded wool blanket in front of the stove, barely moving. Her breathing had become shallower since they brought her in, but it was steadier now, no longer the wheezing rasp that had haunted the ride home. Jack had managed to clean some of the blood from her fur with warm water and an old cotton undershirt, revealing a deep gash along her side and the beginnings of frostbite on her hind paws. He worked silently, carefully, using hands that knew how to mend broken things. But as he dabbed antiseptic on the wound, her body flinched. He paused, his voice low and even. "I know, girl. I know it hurts." He didn't want to use a name that might be wrong, so he called her sweetheart in a voice that belonged to the past. His mother had used that same tone when he was little, when he'd scraped his knees on gravel or come in crying with pockets full of broken bird eggs. It was the voice of comfort, and though the dog couldn't understand the words, she seemed to recognize the shape of kindness in them. Mikey had fallen asleep in the old armchair across the room, one arm draped over the thick armrest, his other hand hanging down as though he'd been trying to reach out to the dog even in dreams. The firelight bathed his face in soft gold. His cheeks still bore the faint flush of crying earlier, the kind of tears a child tries to hide when they feel something break open inside them. He hadn't said much after Jack told him the dog was only staying the night. Just curled into the chair with a blanket and watched her, eyes wide and silent, like he was guarding something sacred. Jack had moved the dog closer to the stove, rotating her gently so her paws would stay warm. The old cabin was drafty in the best of weather, and tonight it seemed to moan and creak with every gust. The insulation was spotty, and the furnace had died the winter before, leaving the stove as their only reliable heat. But that night, it felt like the center of the world. Outside, the storm had turned feral, bending the tree limbs and hurling frozen branches against the walls. The wind slipped through the chinks in the windows with a high-pitched whine that reminded Jack of old train whistles. He imagined the dog out in that cold, alone, and it made something in his chest twist. She had made it through the worst of it. She had crawled her way toward the only light for miles, and now here she was, shivering but alive. He brought her a bowl of water, and she lapped at it slowly, barely lifting her head. When he offered a bit of boiled chicken, she sniffed it once and turned her face away. That worried him more than the wounds. Jack sat beside her on the floor, his back against the stone hearth, his knees pulled close to his chest. He watched the fire dance in the glass of the stove door, letting its warmth creep up his arms. The silence settled over him like a quilt. It was the kind of quiet he rarely allowed himself. At work, he filled the hours with noise saws buzzing, hammers pounding, radios playing half-tuned country songs. At home, Mikey's presence filled in the rest, the clatter of toys, the questions, the laughter, the cries. But now, the world had gone still, and there was nothing to do but sit beside a broken dog and feel every moment as it passed. His gaze drifted to the wooden beams above, rough with age. He'd built most of this place himself, the rest finished with help from his father before he passed. Each board held a memory, each nail driven with purpose. And now this old cabin, this worn and weathered space, was sheltering something that neither of them had expected. He found himself speaking without planning to. "I lost someone too," he said softly. The dog didn't move, but her breathing slowed, steady. She left, not in the way people talk about in movies. No accident, no dramatic goodbye. Just one day gone, and a note on the counter that said she wasn't meant to be a mother. His voice cracked, the words catching at the edge like dry leaves. He cleared his throat. "I kept that note for a while. Thought maybe I'd figure it out. Maybe she'd come back. But people who mean to leave, they don't make plans to return." He rubbed a hand over his face. It was the kind of confession he never made aloud, especially not to Mikey. But the dog didn't flinch. She didn't judge. She just breathed, her chest rising and falling with a rhythm that felt older than pain. "You're safe now," he whispered. "You made it home." The stove hissed quietly as sap bubbled from the log. Jack felt his eyelids grow heavy. The warmth, the quiet, the tension of the drive, it all pressed down on him like a weighted blanket. He stood, his knees stiff, and gently laid another folded blanket over the dog. She stirred only slightly, her head tilting toward the fire. As he moved to check on Mikey, he noticed something strange through the frosted pane of the window. A red light, blinking slowly, hovering near the treetops beyond the cabin. He squinted. Could have been a reflection, maybe from the stove or the last of the twilight off something in the yard, but it moved. Just for a second. He stood there, watching, the hairs on his arms prickling. But the light vanished, swallowed by the snow. Jack turned away, dismissing it as fatigue. Probably a snowplow on the ridge, or a trail marker caught in the wind. He knelt beside Mikey, tucking the blanket up over his chest, and pressed a kiss to his temple. The boy murmured something in his sleep, a fragment of a dream, the only word clear being Scout. Jack smiled softly. "Scout, huh?" he said, glancing back at the dog. The name settled into the air like it had always belonged. She didn't move, but her ear twitched. Scout. It fit. Simple, brave, and stubborn enough to survive the storm. Jack turned down the last of the lamps, letting the room slip into a hush. The storm could rage all it wanted. Inside this cabin, 3 souls breathed together in a circle of firelight. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like they weren't alone. The mansion sat at the top of the ridge like a sentinel carved from stone and steel, its edges sharp and modern against the soft curvature of the snow-covered hills. From a distance, it looked abandoned, swallowed by the blizzard and ghosted in white. But inside, the house breathed with low warmth and the constant hum of machines. The walls were lined with quiet, pulsing light, barely perceptible beneath smooth concrete and glass, like the veins of some sleeping thing. Screens glowed in the dark like eyes. Eli sat in the soft leather of his chair, angled slightly toward the wide, panoramic window that overlooked the valley. A sheen of frost fogged the edges of the glass, curling in delicate patterns like lace. Beyond it, the storm still raged, a rolling curtain of snow blurring the trees, the mountains, and even the distant, half-hidden ribbon of road that wound through the hollow below. Somewhere out there his dog was supposed to be. He hadn't slept. Not really. A few hours before dawn he had tried, had lain in the bed that felt too large and too sterile, listening to the wind moan against the rafters and the vents whisper through the floor. Every few minutes he found himself checking the surveillance monitors lined up on the far wall of his study. Camera feeds, thermal drones, motion alerts. The perimeter of his property mapped in infrared, with details fed in from a drone patrol that circled the outer boundaries like moths around flame. He kept watching the same clip, a thermal feed, time-stamped at 6:17 p.m. the night before. Through the white fog, the camera had captured the faint figure of a golden retriever stumbling across the snow. The signature was weak, the body heat low enough to be alarming. The dog paused, fell, and lay still. Then a shape emerged from the left larger, bipedal, human, a man. He moved with urgency, bent down, wrapped the dog in what looked like a coat, and carried her toward a rusted pickup truck. The headlights lit the dog's face just enough. Daisy. He had frozen in place when he saw her. Her eyes, dulled but unmistakable, the slope of her head, the golden-red coat that had once glowed in the sun like fire. She had been gone for 2 days. Vanished through the trees when the service gate short-circuited and the storm hit. He had been furious at first, then sick, then numb. He reached for the keyboard with fingers that still trembled and zoomed in, frame by frame. The man was built solidly, dressed in flannel and jeans, unshaven and tired-looking, but there was a strange gentleness in the way he carried the dog. He held her as if she were something breakable, precious, like he had known her far longer than the 2 minutes captured in the clip. Eli leaned back and exhaled through his nose. His breath felt tight in his lungs. The chair adjusted beneath him with a quiet mechanical sigh, molding to the curve of his spine and the angle of his hip. His legs were wrapped in a wool blanket, but they hadn't moved in hours. He ignored the ache that began in his lower back and instead tapped a key to call up the drone footage from later that evening. There it was, the truck pulling slowly up to a narrow log cabin buried in snow. A small boy waiting near the window, a fire glowing warm through the glass. Daisy, bundled, disappearing inside. He watched it 3 times, pausing each time as the man reached the porch. The camera had tried to adjust focus through the blizzard, but the resolution wasn't clear enough to catch his face fully. Still, there was something about the man's posture that tugged at Eli. Something quiet, unshaken by the cold. Clara entered the room without knocking, her boots silent on the slate floor. She carried a tablet in one hand and a steaming mug in the other. The scent of coffee and cinnamon cut briefly through the sterile, conditioned air. She paused by the window, looking out over the storm. "We tracked the plates," she said, her voice soft but crisp. "His name's Jack Monroe. Lives about half a mile from here, down by the old creek line. Carpenter, widowed, or rather, separated. No police record. 1 kid." Eli nodded slowly. He already knew most of it. He had watched enough of the town's public records to guess at the rest. Clara handed him the tablet. A photo filled the screen. Jack, in a dusty blue shirt, standing beside a little boy with grass stains on his knees. They were smiling at something just off camera. The boy's head was tilted toward his father's chest, as if leaning into his shadow. "Mikey," Clara added. "8. Has a reading delay, according to the last school report, but otherwise healthy." Eli closed the photo and turned his chair slightly to face the fire crackling in the hearth. Even with the heat vents flowing, the cold never quite left his bones. The accident had done more than take the feeling from his legs. It had cracked something open that never quite sealed. Since then, Daisy had become more than a dog. She was a link to something alive in him. She had stayed curled at his side through the long nights, when the pain was phantom but unbearable, when the medications blurred the world too much to stay grounded and too little to forget. "She's alive," Clara said gently. "And she's warm. He did that for her." He didn't respond. His fingers hovered above the keyboard. He could have activated the alert. He could have sent someone to retrieve her immediately, but he hadn't. Not yet. "He's not trying to keep her," Clara added, watching him closely. "He didn't hide her. There was no collar, no tag. He probably figured she was just a stray who got caught in the storm." Eli's jaw twitched. He wrapped her in his coat. He gave her the front seat. "That's not a crime." "No," Eli said, almost absently. "It's not." Outside, the storm began to wane, the wind softening like a breath drawn inward. For the first time in 2 days, the sky began to lighten. The trees returned to view as the snowfall thinned. The shape of the cabin emerged in the distance again, huddled low against the mountain. A small column of smoke curled from the chimney. Eli tilted his head and looked down at the flame. The heat did little to touch the cold that had settled in his chest, but he let the quiet fill the space between his ribs. "She chose him," he said quietly. Clara raised a brow. "Dogs don't choose sides. They find warmth, they find safety, they stay." "But it wasn't random," Eli said, more to himself than to her. "She was looking for something." "Even if she was," Clara said, "you're still her registered owner. We can bring her home today." Eli stared at the flickering orange behind the glass, feeling the way his muscles refused to move without conscious effort. He reached out and tapped the pause button on the drone feed. Jack, standing on the porch, firelight behind him, cradling Daisy in his arms like a father would hold a child. "Not today," he said finally. Clara didn't argue. She knew better than to push when his voice dropped to that quiet pitch. As she left the room, Eli turned back to the window. The snow had softened to a gentle drift, barely visible now. Somewhere down the slope, in a cabin no one had ever thought twice about, Daisy lay curled beside a fire, alive, warm, safe. He leaned forward, rested his elbow on the arm of the chair, and pressed 2 fingers gently against his lips. His breath fogged the glass, just faintly. He did not pray. He had stopped praying years ago. But he hoped. Snow clung to the trees like a second skin, glittering where the first strands of sun broke through the thinning clouds. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world shrouded in white and hushed to stillness. Jack stood at the cabin's front step, a mug of coffee warming his palms, steam rising and curling in the early light. Beneath the scent of fresh snow was the faint tang of ash from the chimney, a comforting, lived-in smell that sank into the wood of the porch and his flannel sleeves. His breath came in small, frosty clouds as he gazed across the clearing. The yard had turned into a sea of white drifts, smooth and untouched, save for a winding trail of paw prints leading from the front stoop to the edge of the woods and back again. Scout's prints. He'd carried her out there an hour ago, letting her sniff the cold air and stretch her legs. She had limped through the snow with determination, her breath rising in visible huffs, tail swaying gently behind her like a slow metronome. Now she lay curled beside the wood stove again, her body rising and falling with the steady rhythm of sleep. Mikey had bundled a knit scarf around her neck and was kneeling next to her, whispering stories into her ear. His voice rose and fell with quiet excitement, his fingers stroking the thick fur behind her ears. Scout didn't stir. but her tail gave a faint thump against the floor with each pause in the story, like she understood the rhythm, if not the words. Jack leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and let the quiet soak in. The day felt suspended, as if the world had taken a deep breath and paused in its exhale. The cold no longer bit at his face. It was a cleaner kind of cold now, sharp but still, the kind that brought clarity to the edges of thoughts. He watched a pair of crows land on the crooked fence post at the edge of the property. They tilted their heads at each other, black eyes glittering. One let out a low caw and flapped its wings, sending a soft flurry into the air. The old pine beside the porch groaned under the weight of ice. Jack made a mental note to trim the branches before the next storm, then pushed himself back inside, the door closing with a wooden sigh behind him. The warmth embraced him immediately, thick and alive. The stove's heat had reached every corner of the room, turning the chill in the floorboards to a sleepy hum. He crouched beside Mikey, running a hand along Scout's back, careful not to brush the healing wound. Her fur was warm now, soft again. She blinked once at his touch, but didn't lift her head. "She likes stories," Mikey said, smiling up at him with a gap in his teeth. "I told her about the time you built me the boat and we sailed it on the creek." She wagged her tail the most at that part. Jack felt something tighten in his throat, not in a painful way, but in that slow way memories sometimes filled a person up too fast. He kissed the top of Mikey's head, breathed in the boy's sleepy warmth, and nodded. "She's a good listener." "I want to keep her." Jack didn't answer. He didn't want to lie, but he didn't want to shut that light out of Mikey's eyes either. So he just ran his hand down the length of Scout's side again, feeling the rhythm of her breath and the softness of her fur against his calloused palm. Later that morning, he carried Scout outside again, this time placing her gently into a padded basket he'd built with leftover canvas and an old sled. She lay curled inside, front paws tucked beneath her chest, head poking out into the fresh light. Her ears twitched with each creak of snow beneath Jack's boots. Mikey trudged beside them, dragging a shovel twice his height. The air smelled of pine sap and clean frost, and the wind was no longer cruel. Jack worked in long, steady lines, clearing a narrow trail from the porch to the small firewood shed, then another out toward the shed where he kept his tools. Mikey followed along, occasionally helping, occasionally flopping back into the snow to make lopsided angels. Scout watched it all with half-lidded eyes, occasionally perking up when Mikey burst into laughter. At one point, Jack paused beside the edge of the trail and studied the slope beyond the trees. The mountain dipped low there, disappearing into a cluster of evergreens and wind-carved rock. He squinted, his hand shading his eyes. There was a glint of something metallic in the far distance, a line too straight for nature. Maybe a railing, maybe glass. He felt the hairs lift on the back of his neck. The mansion. It wasn't often he thought of the neighbor up the hill, Eli Quinn, the recluse, the tech wizard, the man who'd built a fortress in the woods and then vanished into it. Jack had only seen him twice, both times from a distance, his silhouette behind tinted glass or wheeling himself across a balcony with slow precision. The man never came down to town, never asked for help, never even waved. Just sent deliveries, sometimes via drone, sometimes by men in clean trucks with tinted windows. Rumors followed him like smoke. Billionaire, genius, hermit, ghost. Jack had always assumed he wanted nothing to do with people like him. And Jack, in return, had respected the silence. But now something itched at the back of his mind. The way Scout had found them, the direction she came from, the deep scratch marks on her side, like she had pushed through something sharp, something not of the wild. The wound looked man-made, not from a fight with another animal, something metal. A fence, perhaps, or a gate. He shook the thought off and turned back to the path. When he looked down, Scout was watching him. Her eyes were alert now, deeper somehow. They met his and held steady. "You came from up there, didn't you?" he murmured. She didn't answer, of course, but her tail gave a single slow wag like punctuation. That afternoon, Jack brought out his scrap lumber and began working on a ramp from the porch to the snow trail, something Scout could walk without being lifted. Mikey helped him measure the planks, passing nails with chilly fingers and watching closely as Jack worked the hammer. The sharp sound echoed across the clearing. Each nail drove a little further into the rhythm of the day. Scout lay in the sun that filtered through the open door, her head lifted now, nose twitching toward the scents of pine, sawdust, and melted butter from the kitchen. She didn't sleep, she watched. When they were done, Jack helped her down the ramp. Her steps were slow, but there was strength returning. The pads of her paws pressed into the wood as if relearning the ground. Mikey walked beside her, whispering encouragement, as if she were walking on a tightrope made of dreams. Jack leaned back against the porch post, arms crossed over his chest. He felt a presence beside him and looked down. Scout had returned, nudging his knee with her nose, then sitting beside him. The wind stirred her fur. She closed her eyes. Jack stared out across the trees toward the mountain and the house hidden behind the pine curtain. If she had come from there, he would find out. But not today. Today, there was only sunlight, the smell of fresh wood, and a quiet, living weight pressed gently against his leg. The next morning, the world gleamed as if scrubbed clean. Sunlight spilled through the cabin windows in long golden shafts that warmed the floorboards and cast gentle patterns across the rug where Scout slept. Her fur shimmered in the light, thick and glossy now that the dried blood had been washed away, her breathing deep and slow. Mikey had curled beside her with his book open, reading aloud in soft tones, each word given the reverence of a bedtime story. Jack could hear his voice from the kitchen, light and rhythmic, broken now and then by laughter when Scout gave a lazy thump of her tail or raised her eyes as if she understood. The air inside smelled like coffee and the last of the cinnamon rolls Mrs. Hadley had brought by during the storm. Jack stood at the stove with a mug in one hand, the other resting on the edge of the sink, eyes drifting across the snow-covered yard. The ramp he and Mikey had built looked sturdy beneath its dusting of powder. Beyond it, the woods stood silent and bright, every branch weighed down by the snow's final touch. A chickadee flitted to the feeder near the window, wings beating fast and soundless, like a breath taken too quickly. He felt a quietness in his chest that morning, but it was the kind that did not ache. It was full more than anything, as though the space that had echoed inside him for the last few years had found something soft to hold. The knock on the door startled him. 3 even taps. Not rushed, not tentative. Jack set his mug down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stepped to the door. He opened it slowly, squinting into the brightness. A woman stood on the porch. She wore a sleek gray coat, cinched at the waist, her boots spotless despite the snow. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat braid, and she carried a leather satchel over one shoulder. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, held his for a moment, before her expression softened into something warmer. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was crisp, professional, but not unkind. "Sorry to drop in unannounced. Are you Jack Monroe?" He nodded, unsure whether to be wary or polite. "Yeah. Can I help you?" She smiled and opened the flap of her satchel. "My name is Clara Hastings. I'm with the Colorado Pet Recovery Agency. We received a report about a missing golden retriever in this area. I was hoping I could ask you a few questions." Jack's stomach sank. He didn't say anything right away. His mind raced, already leaping ahead to Mikey's voice behind him, the soft scratch of his book, the sound of Scout shifting in the sun. "I found a dog, yes," he said slowly. "Couple nights ago during the storm. She was in bad shape." Clara nodded. "That lines up with the timeline we have. May I come in?" He hesitated, his hand still on the doorframe, then stepped aside. "Sure, but my son's in there, and the dog's resting. She's not quite up for visitors." Clara stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around her like a blanket. She looked around the cabin with the air of someone taking quiet inventory, noting the stove, the tools near the wall, the stack of books on the shelf. Her eyes landed on Scout almost immediately. She didn't move toward the dog, but her expression changed. Her shoulders dropped a little. Her voice softened. "There she is," she said. Jack felt something pinch at the back of his neck. "You know her?" "Yes," Clara said gently. "Her name is Daisy. She belongs to your neighbor, Eli Quinn." Jack felt the world tilt just slightly beneath him, as if the floor had shifted a half-inch to the side. "The guy on the ridge?" Clara nodded. "He's been searching for her since the night of the storm. She escaped when the fence shorted out. Security lost sight of her in the blizzard." Jack crossed his arms, not out of defiance, but to brace himself. Scout Daisy stirred at the sound of Clara's voice, but didn't rise. She merely blinked once, then laid her head back down on Mikey's foot. "I didn't see a collar," Jack said, trying to keep the edge from his voice. "She lost it in the woods, we think, but she's chipped." Jack's heart clenched. He didn't want to believe the word was final. "Not yet. You scanned her already?" Clara reached into her bag and pulled out a slim black wand. "I can do it now. May I?" He gave a slow nod, and she knelt carefully near Scout, speaking softly as she approached. "Hey there, sweet girl," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You gave us a scare." Scout lifted her head and sniffed the air, eyes tracking Clara's movement with sleepy interest. The scanner let out a faint beep as Clara passed it over her shoulder. There was a pause, then a soft chime. "ID number matches," Clara said, her tone almost apologetic. "It's her." Jack swallowed hard. Mikey looked up at him, his face wide and still. "But we helped her," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I know," Clara said kindly. "And you saved her life. If you hadn't found her, she might not have made it. Mr. Quinn is very grateful." Jack didn't say anything. He crouched beside Mikey and placed a hand on his shoulder. "She has to go back," he said, not wanting to say it, but knowing he had to. "She belongs to someone else." Mikey's eyes welled, and he bit his lip. He didn't cry, but his head dropped, and he leaned against Jack's chest without a word. Clara stood. "You're welcome to come with me. Mr. Quinn asked that you both come if possible. He'd like to thank you in person." Jack looked down at Scout. "No, Daisy." Her head tilted, ears perked, eyes alert now, as if sensing something about to change. She pushed herself up, stiff but determined, and walked to Mikey, nudging her nose into his arm. He wrapped both arms around her neck. "Will she remember me?" he asked. Jack's throat burned. He swallowed against it. "I think so," he said. "I think she always will." They loaded her carefully into Clara's SUV, wrapped in Mikey's old blanket. Jack sat in the back with her while Mikey rode up front beside Clara, staring out the window in silence. As the car climbed the ridge, the trees grew taller and denser. Snow clung to every surface, gleaming like frost-bitten crystal. The mansion came into view slowly, a jagged silhouette against the mountain. Jack had never been this close to it. The gates parted without a sound, sensors hidden in the rock. The house itself looked like something from another world. All glass and metal and angles, clean and impassive beneath the winter sky. As they pulled up the long drive, Daisy lifted her head, ears twitching. Her tail moved once, a soft, uncertain wag. Jack pressed his hand to her side and felt her heartbeat beneath it. "We'll walk you home," he said. And together, they stepped out into the snow, not knowing that what waited beyond the door was not an ending, but the beginning of something far more tangled and tender than any of them had expected. The front doors of the mansion opened without a sound, gliding apart as if moved by breath. Warm air rolled outward, tinged with the scent of cedar and beeswax, and something faintly floral, like jasmine hidden beneath polished wood. Jack stepped into the threshold first, boots damp with snow, Mikey trailing just behind him with wide eyes. The entranceway opened into a vaulted atrium, lit by skylights that filtered soft winter light onto marble floors, so smooth they looked wet. Glass, steel, and warm wood blended together in a strange harmony that felt both intimate and impossibly sterile. Mikey tightened his hand around Jack's. The boy said nothing, but Jack could feel the questions curled in his fingers. A low mechanical hum drifted through the silence before a figure appeared from a corridor to the right, rolling forward in a sleek black wheelchair. Eli Quinn moved with quiet precision, his posture sharp, his expression unreadable behind clear, steel-blue eyes. His hair was short, still tousled at the crown as if sleep or thought had been interrupted. He wore a charcoal sweater and dark pants, the textures soft and rich, unbranded but expensive. There was a certain grace to the way he moved, as if even stillness had been mastered as a form of language. Daisy stirred at Jack's side. The moment her eyes found Eli, her entire body changed. Her tail lifted and wagged with restrained joy, her ears perked, and she gave a soft whine that cracked open something in Jack's chest. She trotted forward, limping only slightly, and closed the space between them in a few slow, purposeful steps. She reached Eli and stopped, pressing her head gently into his thigh. Eli's hand moved to her without hesitation. His fingers buried themselves into the fur behind her ears, and then down her neck, slow, deliberate, like he was reacquainting himself with a part of his own body. "Hey, Daisy girl," he said, his voice so quiet it barely carried across the room. "There you are." Jack had prepared himself for a reunion. He had imagined joy, barking, the thump of a tail against polished floor, but this was different. This was reverence. There was a stillness in it that felt sacred, like something buried deep had just surfaced, and neither man nor dog wanted to disturb it. Mikey stepped closer to Jack, watching everything, silent and alert. Eli looked up then, his hand still on Daisy's head. His eyes found Jack's and held them for a long moment. There was no judgment in them, no suspicion, only a quiet kind of gratitude that felt heavier than words. "You kept her warm," Eli said. Jack nodded once. "She kept herself alive. I just gave her a place to land." "Even so," Eli said. "Thank you." Clara stood near the hallway, arms folded, her posture relaxed now, like her job was done. She glanced toward Mikey and smiled. Mikey didn't smile back, but he didn't shrink either. His gaze drifted between Daisy and Eli, and then to the enormous space around them, like he was trying to take it all in at once. Eli motioned to a bench near the window. "Please, sit down. You've come a long way." Jack hesitated before leading Mikey across the room. The bench was padded in soft leather, warm from the sun through the tall glass panes. From here, the view stretched for miles, all white ridges and deep evergreens heavy with snow. The world looked untouched, like something out of time. Daisy sat beside Eli's chair, still pressed against him, though her eyes flicked now and then toward Mikey, watching him with the cautious loyalty only a dog could manage. "I didn't know she belonged to you," Jack said. "There was no tag. I figured she was a stray, or lost. She got out through a gate that malfunctioned when the generator froze," Eli replied. "By the time we realized she was gone, the storm was already moving in. The drones lost her signal." Jack frowned slightly. "You have drones to watch your dog?" Eli gave a small, wry smile. "Not just for her. For everything. Old habits from a life I used to live. Some of them are harder to let go than others." Jack said nothing. He didn't know this man. He had imagined someone older, colder. The house seemed like the kind of place a man might hide in. But now, watching the way Eli's hand stayed on Daisy's shoulder, like an anchor, Jack saw something else. Not wealth, not secrecy, just a kind of wounded vigilance. "She came a long way," Jack said after a moment. "She had a bad gash on her side. Might have been wire. She limped for the first day. Slept a lot, barely ate. My son named her Scout." Eli looked at Mikey then. "Scout's a good name." Mikey didn't answer. He He was staring at Daisy, his small hands folded tightly in his lap. His lip trembled, but he bit it and stayed silent. "She saved us," Mikey said finally, the words catching on a breath. "I think we saved her too, but she saved us first." Eli nodded, the corners of his mouth shifting. Not quite a smile, but something close. "Would you like to come see her sometimes?" he asked. Mikey's eyes lifted. "Can we?" "If it's all right with your dad," Eli said, glancing at Jack. Jack studied him. There was no edge to the offer, no guilt laid beneath it. Just a man trying to make something right. "I think she'd like that," Jack said. Eli turned slightly in his chair, motioning to Clara. "Show them the garden room." Clara nodded and stepped forward. "It's just down the hall. We've got a conservatory with warm floors and some of Daisy's favorite toys. She used to sleep there before she started sneaking into Eli's bed." "She still does," Eli muttered. Jack rose, ruffling Mikey's hair as he stood. The boy followed Clara without hesitation this time, a trace of hope reigniting in the way his steps bounced softly against the floor. Daisy watched them go, ears lifted, but did not move. Jack lingered, watching his son disappear down the hallway. Then he turned to Eli. "She's a good dog," he said. "She's more than that," Eli replied. They sat in the quiet for a moment, the snow falling again outside the glass, soft and slow like drifting ash. The fire had caught in the hearth at the far side of the room, the logs crackling faintly. For a long moment, neither man spoke. There was no need. Then Jack shifted. "I'm not much of a visitor," he said. "Don't usually do this kind of thing." "I don't usually have guests," Eli answered. "This is new for both of us." Jack gave a short breath of a laugh. "Guess that makes us even." Eli's eyes met his again, and this time, something passed between them that didn't need naming. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of it, a place to stand, if they wanted it. In the next room, Mikey's voice rose in a laugh, followed by the familiar clatter of dognails on tile. Daisy barked once, high and bright. The sound echoed, warm and alive, through every corner of the house. The snowplows came at first light, scraping their way up the ridge with groaning blades and spinning lights that flickered like warning beacons across the untouched white. Jack heard them before he saw them, the low mechanical growl rising up through the trees like a distant engine of time itself, signaling that the world beyond their quiet mountain corner had begun moving again. He stood on the porch with a mug warming his hands, the last of the coffee already gone, but the heat still humming in his palms. Down the trail, Mikey was crouched in the snow, tracing something with a stick. He had been up early, too restless to sit inside. Jack had watched him pull on his jacket and boots before the sun even crested the trees. No words, just motion. Quiet determination. It had been 2 days since they returned Daisy to Eli. She had visited once, the very next afternoon, patting her way down the trail alongside Clara, wagging her tail like she'd never left. Mikey had run out barefoot in the snow, laughing. His joy had cracked the silence like sunlight, splitting a frozen pond. Today, he didn't laugh. He worked in the snow with that same tight focus Jack had seen in himself on long nights with a broken cabinet or a warped beam, a kind of making that filled the cracks. Jack stepped down off the porch and followed the curve of Mikey's tracks until he reached him. The boy had written her name in the snow, Scout, the letters wide and wobbly, but deliberate. Beside them, he had begun a second line, Welcome. Jack didn't say anything. He crouched beside Mikey and watched him draw a heart around the 2 words, the stick moving slowly through the crusted top layer of snow, the heart closing at the bottom with a careful curl. "She'll come back again," Mikey said, not looking up. His voice was steady but quiet. "Won't she?" Jack looked out toward the trees, toward the distant shadow of Eli's house barely visible through the pines. The glass and steel caught the morning light in dull gleams, too far to make out movement but close enough that Jack could imagine Daisy lying in front of the fire, or curled at Eli's feet. "I think she will," Jack said. "She knows where home is." Mikey's shoulders eased. He dropped the stick and turned to look up at his father, eyes searching his face, as if trying to read what hadn't been said aloud. Jack ruffled his hair, then stood. "We've got work to do," he said, nodding toward the tool shed. "The woodpile's running low, and if we want that new railing done before the next storm, we'd better not waste the daylight." Mikey followed him, their footsteps crunching in tandem, two shadows stretching long across the snow. They worked through the morning, the rhythm of hammer and saw stitching the day together. Jack let the labor settle into his muscles. The feel of the wood beneath his hands, the scrape of metal on bark, the scent of sap and sawdust. Mikey handed him nails and measured boards, eyes brightening as the pieces came together. By early afternoon, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the edges of the ramp they had built for Scout. Water dripped from the eaves in slow, rhythmic drops. Jack leaned back to admire their work when a low hum reached his ears. He straightened, brushing sawdust from his hands, and turned toward the drive. A sleek black SUV pulled into view, tires crunching softly over gravel and snowmelt. The passenger door opened before the engine even stopped, and Daisy jumped down, tail wagging, body wiggling with restrained joy. Mikey gasped and ran to her, arms flung wide. She met him halfway, almost knocking him down, their laughter and barks echoing into the trees. Clara stepped out next, followed by Eli, who wheeled himself down a small portable ramp from the back of the vehicle. Jack watched him with a nod, then walked over to meet them. "She insisted," Eli said, his voice dry but with a warmth beneath it. "Sat by the front door for 2 hours. We figured there was no point arguing." Jack smiled and glanced toward his son, who now sat in the snow, arms wrapped around Daisy's neck, forehead resting against her fur. "She's earned the right," he said. Eli turned his chair slightly, taking in the scene. His expression softened, his eyes lingering on the boy and the dog, as if the shape of them together filled some hollow space in him. "You ever think about doing something more with all this?" he asked suddenly. Jack looked at him. "What do you mean?" "Building. Carpentry. You've got a talent for it. I've seen the porch, the ramp, even that birdhouse hanging off your shed. There's something thoughtful in your work." Jack rubbed the back of his neck, unsure how to respond. "It's just something I do to keep us going, pays the bills, keeps my hands busy." "I have a barn," Eli said. "It's old, sturdy but underused. I've been thinking about turning it into a shelter, a place for rescues, like Daisy." Jack blinked. "A shelter?" Eli nodded. "Dogs like her, dogs who've been out in the storm, who need a place to land. I've got the resources, but I don't have the hands, or the heart. I'd need someone who knows how to build with both." The silence stretched between them. Jack looked at his hands, the calluses, the scars, the strength worn into his knuckles from years of work. He looked back at his son. Mikey was showing Daisy the snow writing. She pawed at it, tongue lolling, and gave a joyful bark. Mikey threw his head back and laughed, the sound bright and clear as bells. Jack turned back to Eli. "I'd like to see the barn." Eli smiled. "Good." The sun dipped lower, turning the snow gold. Jack walked beside Eli as Clara followed them toward the SUV. Mikey ran up with Daisy at his heels. "Can she stay for dinner?" Mikey asked, his breath visible in the cold. Jack looked to Eli. The man gave a small nod. "Just bring her back before dark," he said. And for the first time, it felt like they weren't just neighbors. They were something more, something undefined but forming. A bridge, a tether, a beginning. As the wind picked up and the trees whispered, Jack felt it settle around him. The sense of something being built. Not from lumber or nails, but from hope. The barn stood at the edge of Eli's property like an old sentinel, weathered and half forgotten, its red paint faded to rust and rose, curling at the edges where time had gnawed away at the wood. Ivy climbed the far wall in brittle tangles, dry from winter's grip, and the windows were mostly dusted over or cracked in the corners, giving only fractured glimpses of the darkness within. But the bones were good. Jack could tell with one glance. The structure leaned a little on its south side, and one beam near the loft door sagged under its own weight, but the frame was strong. It had been built for storms. Jack stepped through the wide entrance, his boots crunching over old straw and dirt. The air inside smelled of cold earth, rusted metal, and the ghost of hay that had long since been carted off. Dust hung in thin ribbons in the shafts of light spilling through the high windows. He ran his hand along a support post near the doorway, the surface rough beneath his calloused fingers, the grain still firm despite the wear. Eli rolled in behind him, his wheelchair crunching over the uneven floor, wheels moving with quiet insistence. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he looked around slowly, his eyes roaming the beams and rafters with a gaze Jack recognized. Not one of luxury or aesthetics, a builder's gaze. Someone who saw not just what was there, but what could be. "Used to keep horses here," Eli said, his voice echoing softly in the cavernous space. "Years ago, before the accident, I didn't come back in here for a long time." Jack glanced at him, but Eli wasn't watching. His eyes had drifted upward, toward the loft where sunlight poured through a broken window like a waterfall of light. "It's a good space," Jack said. "Open, dry, solid foundation." Eli nodded once. Could it be something more? Jack walked farther in, pulling a measuring tape from his pocket and stretching it across one of the beams. His breath made small clouds in the cold, and each step stirred dust into lazy spirals. He didn't answer right away. He needed to feel the space, to move through it, to hear the way his boots echoed off the walls. Only then did he speak. "You want to house dogs in here? You'll need insulation, heating, sectioned stalls, something soft underfoot, and light, real light, not just slivers through the roof." "I've already got solar panels feeding the mansion," Eli said. "I could extend that grid." Jack smiled, the curve subtle and surprised. "You've thought about this." "I've had time." They walked the space together, Eli pointing out corners he had envisioned as play areas, spaces for feeding, for quiet rest. Jack noted the angles of the roof, where to brace the weight for a new ceiling fan. His hands moved constantly, gesturing in the air, sketching invisible lines as he imagined walls that did not yet exist. There was a shared rhythm forming between them, a kind of wordless partnership that came not from conversation but from the mutual language of building. Neither man had to explain the feeling of something unfinished, slowly taking shape beneath their palms. Later that day, Mikey arrived with Daisy in tow. The girl padded into the barn with all the calm dignity of a queen returning to her castle. She sniffed every corner, nose twitching, tail swaying gently. Mikey ran up the loft stairs and called down about a rope pulley still hanging from the crossbeam. Jack chuckled and reminded him to be careful, his voice low but touched with something lighter than warning. Warmth, maybe. Or pride. Eli watched it all from below. Jack caught the look on his face once, when he thought no one noticed, a quiet mixture of wonder and ache, like someone standing in the doorway of a life they hadn't believed they could enter. They worked through the week. Each morning Jack arrived before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, tools slung across his back, his thermos steaming in his gloved hand. Mikey often came with him, reading in the corner or running lengths of tape measure across the floor when asked. Daisy followed them most days, curling up near the space heater Eli had brought in, or weaving between piles of lumber with her ears perked. The barn began to change. The walls were cleared, then framed. Jack sourced reclaimed wood from an old mill down in Granby, wood with nail scars and knots that carried their own histories. Eli ordered radiant heating strips and triple-glazed skylights, insisting they start at the top, letting in the sky. Jack built stalls with half walls so the dogs wouldn't feel penned, each with a warm corner and space to lie near their neighbor if they wanted. He carved a wooden sign with his hands late one evening, etching the words slowly and carefully with his sharpest chisel. Second chances. When he showed it to Eli, the man ran his fingers across the grooves without speaking. After a long moment, he looked up, his voice lower than usual. That's what she gave me, you know. After the fall, I couldn't move, couldn't feel. I didn't want to speak, just wanted to disappear into the machines. Daisy wouldn't let me. She sat by the bed until I had to come back. Jack nodded, understanding not just the words but the silence between them. He had his own version of that story. A different loss, a different ghost, but the same long climb back. One night, after the walls had gone up and the floors were nearly finished, they lit a fire in an old iron stove Eli had salvaged from storage. The barn filled with a golden heat, the kind that settled in the joints and behind the ribs. Mikey sat by the stove with a mug of cocoa, his cheeks flushed from laughter as Daisy trotted around him in circles. Jack and Eli leaned against the far wall, watching the flickering firelight dance across the new wood. "Feels like something's breathing in here now," Eli said. Jack nodded. "It's not just a building anymore." Eli glanced at him. "Neither are we." The words hung there for a while, long enough to be real. Outside, snow had begun to fall again. Not in heavy sheets, but in soft, quiet flakes that landed without sound. The night air carried the scent of pine smoke and cedar and something warmer still. Belonging. The barn stood taller now, not just repaired but reborn. A space shaped not just by hands but by intention, by the slow, honest labor of grief turning back into love. It was not just a place for dogs. It was for anyone who had been lost in the storm, anyone looking for a way back home. The knock came just after dusk, soft and slow, the kind of knock that hesitates before it lands. Jack stood in the kitchen with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, rinsing paint from a brush in the sink. The barn had been nearly finished that day, the last coat of sealant drying on the stalls while Mikey scattered cedar chips into soft piles, and Daisy wandered between each one as if blessing them with her approval. Jack had come home tired but whole, the kind of tired that came from working toward something that felt like it mattered. Outside, the sky had gone slate gray, the last streaks of sunset bleeding away behind the ridge. Snow clung to the trees like lace, and the first stars had just begun to wink through the canopy when the knock came again. Jack wiped his hands on a towel and crossed the floor. He opened the door expecting Clara or maybe Eli, maybe even one of the neighbors checking in about the upcoming fundraiser Eli had floated at the last town meeting. He did not expect her. Kara stood on the porch, wrapped in a long wool coat the color of wine, her hair longer than it had been 3 years ago and pulled back from her face in a loose braid. Her eyes were the same, though, sharp and searching, always a little tired even when she smiled. Snowflakes clung to her collar like tiny stars. She looked up at him, and Jack felt something go cold and still inside his chest. "Hey," she said. It took him a breath too long to answer. "Kara." She offered a small smile, then glanced past his shoulder into the warm light of the house. "I was in Denver," she said, shifting her weight. "Figured I'd see him, see you, if that's okay." Jack didn't move. The words landed somewhere behind his ribs, dull and heavy. He looked past her to the car idling at the base of the drive, its headlights like eyes peering through the dark. "Mikey's inside," he said. Her shoulders relaxed, just slightly. "I don't want to disrupt anything. I just thought it was time." Jack let the silence hang there for a beat, then stepped aside. "Come in." The cabin felt smaller with her in it, not because she filled the space, but because she echoed inside it. Every corner felt touched by memory suddenly. The place where she used to leave her coffee half-finished, the nail in the wall where she had once hung her grandmother's scarf. Jack watched her look around, taking in the changes. New photos on the shelf, Mikey's drawings on the fridge, a different rug near the stove. Her gaze softened when it landed on the small pile of toys by the fire. "Mikey," Jack called, his voice quiet. There's someone here to see you." The boy appeared in the hallway, hair damp from a bath, wearing the mismatched pajamas with the stars he never wanted to give up. He saw her and stopped. His face didn't shift right away. His hands gripped the doorway. For a long moment, no one moved. "Hey, baby," Kara said. Her voice cracked. "You've gotten so big." Mikey blinked. Then he turned and disappeared into the hallway. Jack closed his eyes. The pain in her face was immediate and raw, but she didn't speak. She just nodded and sank into the nearest chair as if the wind had left her bones. "I didn't know he would run," she said. "I hoped." Jack leaned against the counter, arms folded. "You hoped he'd fall into your arms." She looked down at her hands. "I know I have no right." He didn't answer. The sound of Mikey's footsteps faded upstairs. Daisy padded into the room, sniffed Kara's boots, and then moved to the hearth, curling there with a sigh. The firelight cast golden ripples across her fur. "I don't want to cause trouble," Kara said. "I'm not here to take him. I've changed. I needed to see who he is, who you are now." Jack's voice was steady, but low. "You left without a word, a note. You didn't call. You didn't ask." "I wasn't well. You didn't ask." She flinched. "I know." The silence between them was not angry. It was tired, frayed around the edges. Years of wondering and explaining folded into a stillness too fragile to touch. Jack looked down at the counter, his hands resting on the grain. "He's good," he said quietly. "He reads before bed now. He makes things with his hands. He talks to the dog like she's human. He's got his quiet days, but he's good." Kara nodded, her eyes shining. "You did right by him." Jack didn't respond. "I'd like to visit," she said. "When he's ready. Not today. Just when it feels okay." He looked at her then. Really looked. She wasn't the girl he had chased across the river once, who had laughed with her whole body and whispered dreams into the crook of his neck. She was a woman now, frayed and folded, trying to make amends with her hands open and her shoulders bare. "We'll see," he said. That night, after she left, Mikey came downstairs and crawled onto the couch without a word. Jack let him lean in, his small body warm and quiet. Daisy rested her chin on his knee. "Is she staying?" he asked after a long silence. "No," Jack said. "Not unless you want her to." "I don't know." Jack kissed the crown of his head. "That's okay." The next day, Jack drove out to the lawyer's office in town. The custody paperwork had been lingering in a folder for too long. He signed what needed signing. Clara came too, as a witness. Eli had arranged for a specialist to consult on Mikey's behalf, someone with warm eyes and a gentle voice who spoke to him in the language of drawings and books. A week later, the court granted full custody. There was no celebration, just a quiet dinner at the cabin, Mikey humming as he helped set the table. Jack watched him from the kitchen, hands in soapy water, heart heavier than it had been in weeks, but no longer uncertain. Kara had not called again, not yet. In the barn, the last stall had been filled. A young dog named Tumble, found half frozen near the base of the ridge, now lay curled in a fresh bed of straw. Daisy checked on her every few hours, a soft presence who had become more than a companion. She was a sentinel now, guiding others from storm to shelter. Outside, snow dusted the trees again. Jack stood on the porch that night, hands around a mug of tea, listening to the wind. It no longer howled. It whispered. And in the hush, he heard the sound of something fragile mending. Not completely, but enough. The last storm came late in the season. A quiet, moody thing that wrapped the valley in a final hush of winter. It moved in slowly, whispering along the treetops and laying down a thin layer of snow like someone tucking in a sleeping child. By morning, the ridge was a blanket of soft white again, the trees rimmed with frost, the mountains lost behind curtains of mist. The wind had no teeth left. It breathed more than howled. Inside the cabin, the wood stove glowed with a steady fire, its warmth pulsing gently into the floorboards. The scent of pine smoke clung to the beams and mingled with the yeasty scent of rising bread, something Jack had learned to make on Sundays with Mikey. This morning, the boy stood on a stool beside him, rolling dough with flour-dusted hands and asking endless questions about how yeast worked and whether you could build a house out of dough if you mixed it with enough clay. Jack laughed, not bothering to answer with logic. He watched the light in his son's eyes and answered instead with a story about a kingdom made of sourdough and a queen who ruled with a cinnamon scepter. Mikey listened with solemn attention, the kind of listening that meant he was building something inside himself, shaping it with every word his father gave him. Daisy lay by the fire, her body stretched across the rug, breathing slow and deep. Her ears flicked with the sounds of flour being sifted and pans being scraped, but she didn't move. Tumble, the newest addition, lay curled beside her, smaller and still unsure, looking to Daisy for permission to rest. The barn had filled more quickly than any of them expected. Word had spread about second chances, about the dogs that found warmth on the ridge. People came from all over with stories etched into their palms and hopeful eyes. Some brought dogs wrapped in blankets, carried like children. Others came alone and left with a leash and a second heartbeat pressed to their side. The barn had changed too. Where there had once been straw and silence, there were now soft lights and laughter. Clara came by often, helping with schedules and adoption paperwork, always bringing fresh biscuits or dog-safe peanut butter treats she swore she made herself, though Jack suspected she had a secret bakery supplier. Eli had become a fixture as well, not just the man in the chair at the edge of the room, but part of the rhythm. He had a way of speaking softly that made the most skittish animals lean in, as if his quiet was a kind of gravity. Jack found himself looking forward to those mornings when Eli came down the trail, wheels crunching softly over the gravel, Daisy bounding ahead, tail waving like a banner. They would walk the barn together, checking insulation, tightening hinges, planning a new fence for the play yard. There was always something that needed doing. Eli had taken to sitting near the entrance in the afternoons, watching the sun stretch across the wooden floor, occasionally sketching in a notebook he never showed to anyone. Jack never asked. He didn't need to. There was a kind of intimacy in silence shared, in work done side by side without the need to fill the air. On this morning, the storm's final flakes melted on the windows. The bread rose. Mikey pressed his thumb into the soft center and announced it was ready. Jack set it into the oven while the boy ran to fetch his boots, shouting over his shoulder that Daisy needed a walk and that maybe Tumble could come too, if she promised not to eat any more pine cones. Jack followed with a chuckle, pulling on his coat and watching as Daisy rose with a stretch and shake, already alert and ready. They stepped out into the snow, the air brisk but not biting. The world was still, the way it only got after a snow when everything waited for something to begin. The trees stood tall and white, and the sky above them was pale blue, tinged with silver. Mikey ran ahead, his boots kicking up small flurries, Tumble chasing after him with short, enthusiastic bounces. Daisy trotted beside Jack, her gait sure and fluid, her head held high. At the top of the trail, the barn came into view, its roof dusted with snow, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the stovepipe. The doors were open, and Eli sat just inside, hands resting on the arms of his chair, eyes on the trail as if he had been waiting. He raised a hand in greeting, and Jack waved back. Mikey ran to him and launched into a story about the bread and the pinecone promise, and how Tumble had probably already broken it. Jack reached them a moment later, his breath visible in the cold. He looked at the barn, at the rows of stalls now lined with soft bedding and hand-carved nameplates. At the play yard, just beyond, where a young hound barked with joy as one of the volunteers tossed a stick. "Looks good," Jack said. Eli nodded. "Feels good." They stood there together for a moment, the sun lifting slowly behind them, casting long shadows across the snow. Mikey ran ahead with the dogs, his laughter rising with each leap into the drifts. The sound carried, warm and bright. Jack watched him for a moment, then turned to Eli. "You ever think it would look like this?" Eli's eyes followed the boy. "No, not even close." Jack smiled. "Me neither." The quiet stretched again, but it was a quiet filled with breath and heartbeat and the creak of wood warming in the sun. A quiet earned. Later that day, they all gathered back at the cabin. Clara came with a pie and news of another dog found down by the creek. Jack took the call, promised to come check. Eli stayed through dinner, wheeling himself into the kitchen to help Mikey stir the gravy, pretending he had no idea what he was doing. They ate by the fire, legs stretched toward the warmth, plates balanced on knees, the kind of meal shared without ceremony but full of thanks. Daisy lay beneath the table. Tumble dozed at Mikey's feet. Jack looked around the room, at the laughter, at the light. When the meal was done, and the fire had burned low, Mikey climbed into Jack's lap, his body warm and heavy with sleep. He looked up at his father, eyes half-lidded. "Scout found us," he whispered. Jack brushed his hair back from his forehead. "She did. She brought us here." Jack kissed the top of his son's head. "She brought us home." Outside, the last of the snow melted from the trees. The stars blinked awake one by one. And deep in the barn, where warmth now lived in every corner, a single wind chime stirred gently in the breeze. It song a soft promise in the stillness. Sometimes, it takes a storm to find your way home.